He wasn't supposed to be standing guard anymore, and yet the dog refused to leave the door. Long before sunrise touched the windows of the military hospital in San Diego, a German shepherd sat motionless in the quiet hallway outside intensive care room 214, his broad chest rising slowly with calm, steady breaths while the fluorescent lights hummed softly above polished tile floors that smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain drifting in from the Pacific night air. The staff had noticed him hours earlier when the ambulance first arrived, but no one expected the dog to remain there, perfectly still, amber eyes fixed on the closed door, as if the thin layer of steel and glass between him and the man inside meant nothing at all. His name was Atlas, a war dog who had spent years beside one Marine and one Marine only, Major Ethan Walker, a man known among his unit for quiet courage and the kind of steady leadership that didn't need to be announced. Now Ethan lay inside that room surrounded by machines that whispered and beeped softly, their steady rhythm blending with the distant rumble of traffic along Interstate 5, while Atlas waited outside like a soldier still on duty long after everyone else had gone home. Nurses passed him with gentle curiosity, whispering among themselves as they pushed carts of supplies down the corridor. One of them knelt beside him shortly after midnight and placed a stainless steel bowl of water near his paws. But the shepherd barely glanced at it, his ears shifting slightly toward the door each time footsteps approached from inside the ICU. A security guard had tried to guide him toward the waiting area earlier in the evening, but Atlas simply walked back and resumed his place beside the door, lowering himself onto the floor with the quiet patience of an animal who understood something no one else in that hallway did. Outside the hospital windows, the coastal fog rolled slowly through the parking lot, wrapping the streetlights in a pale halo that flickered across the polished floor each time a car passed. But Atlas never seemed distracted by the world beyond the glass. His attention remained fixed forward, posture tall and composed, the dark saddle of his German shepherd coat rising and falling like a shadow against the sterile white wall. Every so often he lifted his head slightly, nose twitching as if he could sense the faintest change in the air inside the ICU. The scent carried through the narrow seam beneath the door that belonged only to one person in the world. The hours passed quietly. Midnight slipped toward 2 in the morning, and the hospital grew even stiller as the night shift settled into its slow rhythm of chart checks and quiet footsteps. Yet Atlas never moved from his post. Not when the hallway lights dimmed slightly to let patients rest. Not when the janitor's cart rattled past with the soft smell of lemon cleanser. Not even when the automatic doors at the far end of the corridor slid open with a whisper as someone stepped inside from the cool California night. Through it all, the dog remained exactly where he had chosen to be, eyes steady, ears alert, body relaxed but ready, as if somewhere deep inside his instincts a silent promise had already been made. And until that promise was fulfilled, the war dog would guard the door all night. By 3 in the morning, the hospital had settled into the strange stillness that only exists between night and dawn, a quiet hour when even the machines seemed to breathe more softly and the world outside felt distant from the fluorescent calm of the corridor. Atlas had not changed position except to shift his weight slightly, his tail wrapped neatly along the floor as though he had been trained to occupy exactly that space and no other. A young nurse named Melissa Carter stepped out of the ICU with a clipboard pressed against her chest, her sneakers whispering against the tile as she paused beside the German shepherd once again. She had checked on the patient inside several times since midnight, and every time she opened the door the dog lifted his head, watching her with an alert patience that felt almost human. She crouched slowly, careful not to startle him, and spoke in the soft voice people often used around animals and sleeping patients. "You are still here, huh, buddy?" The shepherd flicked one ear toward her voice, but his gaze drifted immediately back to the door, as if the sound that mattered most was not human speech, but the quiet pulse of life inside the room beyond the glass. Melissa glanced down the hallway where the dim lights stretched in a pale line toward the nurse's station. She had worked enough overnight shifts to recognize loyalty when she saw it, but there was something different about this dog, something steadier than ordinary attachment. Atlas looked less like a worried pet, and more like a sentry who understood exactly why he had been placed at that door. The nurse reached slowly into her pocket and pulled out a small wrapped packet of crackers from the break room, sliding it across the floor toward him. The shepherd sniffed the air for a moment, then gently nudged the packet aside with his nose without opening it, as if food simply did not matter while his attention belonged somewhere else. Melissa let out a quiet breath and leaned back against the wall for a moment, studying the patient chart clipped to her board. Major Ethan Walker, United States Marine Corps, 36 years old, admitted earlier that evening after an emergency transport from a training facility outside the city. The notes were brief but clear. Stable condition. Unconscious but responsive to treatment. She glanced back toward the door and imagined the man behind it, a soldier who had likely spent years standing watch in places most people would never see. It felt strangely fitting that even here, miles from any battlefield and surrounded by the quiet efficiency of hospital staff, someone was still keeping watch beside him. The corridor lights flickered faintly as the building shifted into its lower power cycle for the early morning hours. Outside the windows, the fog had begun to thin, and a faint silver glow hinted at the coming sunrise somewhere beyond the Pacific. Atlas lifted his head slightly then, nostrils flaring as though he sensed something changing in the world around him. His ears turned toward the door again, and for the first time all night his posture straightened just a little more, muscles gathering beneath his coat, like a soldier hearing the distant call of morning roll call. Melissa noticed the movement and followed his gaze toward the ICU room, the quiet hum of the monitors continuing behind the glass while the dog remained perfectly still once more, waiting with the calm certainty of a creature who believed that the man inside would eventually need him again. The first light of morning crept slowly through the high windows of the corridor, turning the polished floor into a pale ribbon of silver that stretched toward the nurse's station, while the quiet rhythm of the hospital continued in steady breaths of machinery and distant footsteps. Atlas remained at the door exactly where he had chosen to keep watch, but something in his posture had changed as the night finally began to loosen its hold on the building. His ears stood higher now, turning slightly with every faint sound that drifted from inside the room beyond the glass, and his amber eyes held the calm intensity of an animal that trusted his instincts more than the passing hours. Nurse Melissa Carter noticed the difference immediately as she returned from the station with a fresh chart in her hand and a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. She paused a few feet from the dog and followed his gaze toward the ICU door, sensing the quiet tension that had begun to settle in the hallway like the moment before a storm breaks. The machines inside the room continued their soft chorus of steady beeps and measured breaths, but Atlas leaned forward slightly, his nose lifting as if he could hear something deeper beneath the mechanical rhythm. Melissa pushed the door open just a few inches and stepped carefully into the room, the scent of antiseptic and clean linen greeting her as she approached the bed where Major Ethan Walker rested beneath the glow of soft monitoring lights. The Marine looked peaceful in the quiet of the early morning, his chest rising slowly while the machines tracked every movement with quiet precision. Melissa checked the monitors one by one, adjusting a small sensor near his hand before writing a note on the chart clipped to the bed rail. For a moment, nothing seemed different from the last time she had entered the room during the long night shift. Yet something in the air felt slightly altered, like the subtle shift that comes when a sleeping house begins to wake. Outside in the corridor, Atlas had moved closer to the door, not crossing the threshold, but sitting so near that the faint brush of his fur touched the metal frame. His breathing slowed again as he listened. Inside the room, Melissa turned toward the bed once more, just as a small change flickered across the monitor beside Ethan Walker. It was almost too subtle to notice at first, a slight variation in the steady line of numbers that recorded the quiet language of the body at rest. She leaned closer, studying the screen with practiced focus. The Marine's hand rested loosely against the sheet, fingers relaxed after hours of stillness. Then one finger twitched. The movement was small enough that anyone glancing casually might have missed it, but Melissa saw it clearly and felt a sudden spark of alertness move through her chest. She looked from the monitor back to the man in the bed, waiting for another sign. In the hallway, Atlas gave a soft breath through his nose, the faint sound of recognition that only a loyal companion might understand. His tail shifted once against the floor, not wagging yet, but alive with quiet anticipation. The sunrise had begun to brighten the windows now, warm light stretching slowly across the corridor while the hospital woke to the beginning of another ordinary day. But at the door of room 214, the German Shepherd remained completely focused, eyes steady, body still, waiting for the moment when the man inside would finally return to the world beyond sleep. Melissa Carter remained beside the bed, her eyes fixed on the subtle movement she had just witnessed while the early morning light grew stronger beyond the hospital windows. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it, because in a place like this, where machines spoke louder than human voices, even the smallest change could feel uncertain. She watched the hand of Major Ethan Walker carefully, her breath held in quiet concentration as the monitor continued its calm rhythm beside the bed. The numbers remained steady, but the memory of that tiny movement lingered in her mind. Outside the room, the hallway had begun to wake. A cart rolled softly past the nurse's station. Someone spoke in a low voice at the end of the corridor. The hospital was slowly stepping out of the long stillness of night and into the ordinary motion of morning. Atlas heard every sound. His ears shifted slightly as footsteps moved closer and then faded again, yet his attention never truly left the door. When Melissa stepped out of the room again, he lifted his head immediately, searching her face as though he could read the answer he had been waiting for through her expression alone. The nurse paused beside him and exhaled slowly, kneeling so that she was level with the tall shepherd. There was a warmth in her eyes now, a quiet sense that something important might be beginning to change. She spoke softly, the way people do when hope feels fragile. "I think he is trying to wake up," she said gently, not certain whether the dog understood the words, but somehow believing he understood the meaning behind them. Atlas tilted his head slightly, listening to the tone rather than the language, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital his tail moved across the floor in a slow and careful sweep. The motion was small but unmistakable, the first sign that his long night of waiting might finally be reaching its purpose. Melissa stood again and looked back through the small glass window in the door. Inside the room, the Marine rested quietly beneath the pale morning light, the same calm expression still across his face, yet something had shifted in the atmosphere around him. The steady line of the monitor carried a slightly different rhythm now, subtle but real. The nurse walked back into the room once more and approached the bedside, placing 2 fingers gently near the patient's wrist while watching the screen beside him. For several seconds nothing happened. Then it came again, that small movement she had noticed earlier. Ethan Walker's fingers curled just slightly against the sheet, not enough to fully wake, but enough to show that somewhere beneath the quiet surface of sleep the mind was beginning to rise toward the world again. Melissa felt a spark of excitement lift through her chest, and she reached for the intercom button beside the bed to notify the attending physician. Outside the door, Atlas sat taller now, his entire body alert, as if an invisible thread had just pulled tight between him and the man inside the room. His breathing quickened for a moment before settling again into the steady patience that had carried him through the long hours of darkness. The rising sun now poured warm light through the corridor windows, painting the floor with gold while the hospital came fully alive around him. Yet Atlas remained exactly where he had chosen to be, watching the door with unwavering focus, ready for the moment when the voice he had followed across years of service would call for him once more. Morning continued to brighten the hospital corridor as the steady rhythm of footsteps and quiet voices replaced the deep silence of the night shift. Atlas remained beside the door, but now his posture carried a new alertness that had not been there during the long hours before sunrise. His ears remained forward, catching every movement behind the door as though the faint sounds of the room beyond were guiding him more clearly than sight ever could. Inside the room the air had changed as well. The attending physician, Dr. Robert Halpern, stepped in beside Melissa Carter while reviewing the monitor readings with calm professional focus. He studied the numbers carefully, then glanced toward the patient lying peacefully beneath the soft glow of the ceiling light. Major Ethan Walker remained still, yet the signs of life on the monitor now held a slightly stronger rhythm than before. Dr. Halpern placed 2 fingers lightly along the Marine wrist and nodded once as he felt the pulse beneath the skin. His voice carried a quiet reassurance when he spoke. "He is responding. That is a very good sign." Melissa felt a small wave of relief move through her chest as she adjusted the blanket near Ethan's shoulder. The room remained calm and quiet, but the atmosphere no longer carried the heavy uncertainty that had lingered through the night. It felt more like the beginning of something rather than the waiting for an ending. Outside the door, Atlas listened to the movement of voices within the room. He did not bark or whine. Instead, he stood slowly for the first time since the early hours of the night, stretching his legs with deliberate calm before settling again into a seated position directly facing the door. A passing orderly paused for a moment when he saw the shepherd reposition himself. The man had noticed the dog earlier in the night and now watched with quiet curiosity. "That dog has not left since they brought the Marine in," he said softly to a colleague pushing a cart nearby. The woman glanced toward Atlas and nodded with a small smile. "Some partners take their job very seriously." The words drifted down the hallway and faded into the morning noise of the hospital, but Atlas remained focused only on the room in front of him. Inside the ICU, Dr. Halpern adjusted one of the monitors and then stepped slightly closer to the bed. Ethan Walker's breathing had grown. A little deeper now, the slow rhythm rising and falling with more strength than before. Melissa noticed another subtle movement in his hand and leaned forward carefully, watching as the Marine fingers shifted once more against the sheet. The motion was still small, but it was stronger than the earlier twitch. Dr. Halpern observed the change and allowed a faint smile to cross his face. He spoke gently, not certain whether the patient could hear him, but knowing that sometimes the mind recognizes familiar voices even before the eyes open. "Major Walker, you are in a hospital in San Diego. You are safe here." Outside the door, Atlas lifted his head again, the sound of the voice inside reaching him through the quiet hallway. His tail moved once against the floor, a slow and steady sweep filled with patient anticipation. The corridor had fully awakened now with the sound of carts rolling across tile and distant conversations echoing from the nurse's station, yet the German shepherd's attention never drifted. Something deep in his instincts told him that the moment he had waited for through the long night was drawing closer. And when that moment finally arrived, he intended to be exactly where he had always been, waiting for the man who had never once left him behind. The morning sunlight had fully reached the corridor now, spreading warm gold across the polished floor while the hospital moved deeper into the rhythm of a new day. Nurses walked with purpose between rooms, voices low but steady, carts rolling softly past the waiting area where a few early visitors had begun to arrive with coffee cups and quiet hope. Yet beside the door of room 214, the same silent guardian remained exactly where he had been through the long night. Atlas sat tall, his amber eyes fixed on the narrow glass window as though every movement inside carried meaning only he could understand. His breathing was calm but focused, the way a trained dog listens when he knows a command may come at any moment. Inside the room, the atmosphere had grown brighter with the rising sun. Dr. Robert Halpern stood beside the bed reviewing the monitor readings while Melissa Carter adjusted the blinds slightly to soften the morning glare. The steady electronic tones from the machines continued their quiet conversation about the condition of Major Ethan Walker, but now those tones carried a stronger rhythm than they had only an hour earlier. The Marine chest rose and fell with deeper breaths, and the faint color that had slowly returned to his face gave the room a new sense of life. Melissa watched closely as she updated the chart. The fingers of Ethan's right hand shifted again against the sheet. This time, not just a small twitch, but a slow, curling motion as though the body was remembering how to move. Dr. Halpern noticed immediately. "That is another good sign," he said gently. His voice remained calm and professional, but there was quiet optimism behind the words. "Sometimes the body wakes first," he explained softly. "The mind follows shortly after." Melissa nodded while glancing toward the door. Even from inside the room, she knew the German shepherd was still there. She had checked twice earlier in the morning, and each time the dog had remained exactly where he had placed himself. The loyalty of that silent sentry had already become a quiet story among the morning staff. A few nurses at the station had begun referring to him simply as the Marine partner. Outside in the corridor, Atlas heard the faint shift of movement again inside the room. His ears lifted higher, catching the rhythm of footsteps and voices beyond the door. A subtle energy moved through him, not restless but ready, the way a soldier senses the moment before a signal is given. His tail brushed lightly against the floor once, and then grew still again. A young hospital volunteer paused nearby while carrying a stack of folded blankets. She watched the shepherd with gentle curiosity before whispering to the security guard at the end of the hall. "Is that the dog who stayed all night?" The guard nodded quietly. He has not moved from that door since they arrived. The volunteer looked back at Atlas and smiled softly before continuing down the hallway. But the shepherd attention never followed her. Every instinct, he had remained focused on the room beyond the glass. Inside the ICU, Ethan Walker breathing grew slightly stronger again. His hand shifted once more, this time lifting just a fraction from the sheet before settling again. Melissa leaned forward immediately, her eyes bright with recognition of the change. She spoke softly toward the bed. "Major Walker, if you can hear me, you are doing very well." The words floated gently through the quiet room. Outside the door, Atlas leaned forward just slightly, the faintest sound escaping his throat, not a bark but a low breath filled with recognition. Somewhere deep within the instinct that had guided him through years of service beside one man, he knew the moment they had both been waiting for was drawing closer with every passing second. The hospital corridor had fully awakened by late morning, yet a quiet sense of focus still surrounded the door of room 214, as though the space itself understood something important was unfolding inside. Atlas had not left his post even as the day's shift settled in, and the hallway filled with the soft rhythm of shoes against tile and distant voices exchanging routine updates. The German shepherd sat tall beside the door, his posture calm but intensely alert, the warm sunlight now reaching across his dark coat where it pooled on the floor beside him. His ears moved slightly with every sound from within the room, catching faint changes in tone and movement that most human ears would never notice. Inside the ICU, Dr. Robert Halpern continued monitoring the progress of Major Ethan Walker, while Melissa Carter adjusted the small oxygen line near the bed. The Marine breathing had grown deeper and more regular now, each rise of his chest showing strength that had been absent earlier in the night. The machines beside him continued their steady rhythm, but the subtle changes in the readings carried quiet promise. Melissa glanced toward the chart again, noting the time before looking back at the patient. She had worked in the ICU long enough to recognize the moment when a body begins returning to the surface of consciousness, and everything she was seeing suggested that the long sleep was slowly beginning to release its hold. Ethan's fingers moved again against the sheet, this time curling more deliberately as though his hand was remembering its purpose. Dr. Halpern observed the movement and nodded with calm satisfaction. He spoke in a gentle tone that carried both professionalism and encouragement. "Major Walker, if you can hear my voice, you are doing very well. Your body is waking up. There is no rush. Just take your time." The words drifted quietly through the room, and though Ethan's eyes remained closed, there was the faintest shift in his brow, as though some distant part of the mind had recognized the sound. Outside the door, Atlas leaned forward slightly, the movement subtle but unmistakable. His nose lifted toward the narrow seam beneath the door, and he breathed in slowly, as if reading the invisible signals carried on the air. A low sound escaped him then, not a bark and not a whine, but the quiet rumble of recognition that comes when a loyal companion senses the return of someone he knows better than any other voice in the world. Down the corridor, Melissa colleague paused beside the nurse's station and glanced toward the dog again. "That shepherd still has not left," she whispered quietly. Another nurse looked up from her tablet and smiled faintly. "Some partners keep watch longer than anyone expects." Atlas did not hear the words. His attention remained entirely fixed on the room before him. Inside the ICU, Ethan's breathing changed again, becoming slightly uneven for a moment before settling into a deeper rhythm. His fingers moved once more, this time lifting from the sheet just enough that Melissa noticed immediately. She stepped closer to the bed, her voice gentle but filled with hopeful anticipation. "Major Walker, if you can hear me, try to open your eyes." The request floated through the quiet room as the morning sunlight brightened the walls and floor. Outside the door, Atlas sat perfectly still again, every muscle ready, every sense focused on the moment he had waited for through the long hours of darkness. Somewhere beneath the calm silence of the hospital, a bond built through years of shared duty was quietly drawing two lives back toward the same moment once more. The request hung softly in the air of the quiet ICU room as morning sunlight spread wider across the pale walls, and the steady rhythm of hospital life continued just beyond the glass door. Melissa Carter stood beside the bed watching closely, her eyes focused on the face of Major Ethan Walker, while Dr. Robert Halpern remained near the monitors observing the subtle changes that had been unfolding throughout the morning. Ethan's breathing was deeper now, no longer the slow mechanical rhythm of someone completely lost in sleep, but the natural rise and fall of a body slowly remembering the world again. For several seconds nothing happened. The room remained still except for the soft beeping of the monitor and the distant murmur of voices from the hallway. Then a faint movement crossed Ethan's face, a slight tightening around his brow as though light or sound had begun to reach him through the quiet darkness behind his eyes. Melissa leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and reassuring. "Major Walker, you are in the hospital. You are safe. Just take your time." Outside the door, Atlas sat perfectly still, yet the calm posture hid a growing awareness that only instinct could explain. The shepherd's ears lifted higher and turned toward the door while his body leaned forward just enough that the muscles beneath his coat gathered in quiet anticipation. His nose twitched once as he breathed in slowly, recognizing a subtle shift in the scent that drifted from beneath the door. It was a change so small that no one else in the corridor would ever have noticed it. But to a dog who had spent years beside one man through countless long days and longer nights, the signal was unmistakable. Inside the room, Ethan's fingers moved again against the sheet, this time curling more firmly as though the hand was searching for something familiar. Melissa noticed immediately and glanced toward Dr. Halpern with brightening eyes. The physician nodded once, calm but clearly encouraged by what he was seeing. He stepped closer to the bed and spoke again, his tone steady and patient. "Major Walker, if you can hear my voice, try opening your eyes." The words seemed to settle into the quiet space of the room. For a moment nothing changed. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan's eyelids trembled. The movement was small, fragile, but it was real. Melissa felt her breath catch slightly as she watched the first sign that the marine mind was beginning to surface from the deep rest that had held him through the night. Outside the door, Atlas shifted to his feet. The motion was smooth and deliberate, the way a trained partner rises when he senses his moment approaching. His tail moved once behind him, not wagging wildly but swaying with controlled excitement as he stepped closer to the door until his nose nearly touched the glass window. Down the hallway, a nurse glanced up from the station and noticed the change in the dog posture. "He is standing now," she whispered softly to the security guard nearby. The guard looked over and nodded slowly. "Looks like he knows. Something is happening in there." Inside the ICU, Ethan's eyelids trembled once more before opening slightly, the bright morning light filtering into eyes that had been closed for many long hours. The room remained calm and quiet, but something had undeniably changed. The Marine was returning. And just outside the door, the partner who had waited through the entire night was already there, ready to greet the moment the world came back into focus. For several seconds after his eyes opened, the world remained quiet and blurred for Major Ethan Walker, as though his mind was slowly remembering how to exist in the light again after a long journey through darkness. The ceiling above him came into focus first, pale and bright beneath the morning sun that filtered through the hospital blinds. The soft hum of machines reached his ears next, steady and calm like distant engines idling on a quiet runway. Ethan's breathing deepened as he tried to understand where he was. His body felt heavy but stable, the kind of exhaustion that follows long effort rather than pain. Melissa Carter stood beside the bed, watching carefully as recognition slowly began to return to his expression. She offered a gentle smile when she saw his eyes focusing on the room around him. "Good morning, Major Walker," she said in a calm and reassuring voice. "You are in a hospital in San Diego. You are safe. You had a long night, but you are doing very well." Ethan blinked slowly, adjusting to the brightness of the room while his thoughts gathered themselves piece by piece. The words reached him clearly even if the memories of the previous hours remained distant. He turned his head slightly on the pillow and looked toward the nurse, then toward Dr. Robert Halpern standing near the monitor. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke, rough from dryness but steady. "How long have I been here?" Dr. Halpern stepped closer, offering a calm nod that carried both professionalism and reassurance. "Not very long, Major. You arrived late last night. Your body needed time to rest and recover, and it appears that rest has done exactly what we hoped it would do." Ethan listened quietly, taking in the sound of their voices while his senses continued adjusting to the waking world. Then a familiar thought crossed his mind with sudden clarity. His eyes shifted toward the door as though something important waited just beyond it. "Where's Atlas?" The question came immediately, instinctively, as though the name had been waiting just beneath the surface of his thoughts all along. Melissa exchanged a brief glance with Dr. Halpern before smiling gently. "Your partner is right outside the door," she answered. "He has been there all night." Ethan's expression softened instantly, the tension leaving his shoulders as the answer settled in. Outside in the hallway, Atlas stood with quiet patience beside the glass window, his body perfectly still except for the slow movement of his tail across the floor. The moment Ethan's voice carried faintly through the door, the shepherd's ears lifted sharply, catching the familiar sound with instant recognition. His head turned toward the door, and a soft breath escaped him, the kind of quiet sound that belongs to reunion more than excitement. A nurse at the station looked over and noticed the sudden focus in the dog posture. "I think he heard him," she whispered softly. The security guard nearby nodded once. "I believe he did." Inside the room, Ethan's eyes remained on the door now, as if he could sense that his partner was only a few steps away. The long night of waiting had ended, and though neither man nor dog had spoken a word to each other yet, the bond between them had already bridged the distance before the door had even opened. Melissa Carter glanced toward the door after hearing Ethan's question, and a gentle understanding passed between her and Dr. Robert Halpern before she stepped toward the handle. The room had grown warmer with the morning sun now filling the space, the quiet light settling across the white sheets and the steady machines beside the bed. Ethan watched the door with patient focus, his breathing calm as though he already knew what was about to happen even before the moment arrived. Outside in the corridor, Atlas stood with perfect attention, the muscles along his shoulders still yet ready, his amber eyes fixed on the glass window that separated him from the voice he had recognized only moments earlier. When the door latch finally turned with a soft metallic click, the shepherd's ears lifted immediately. The door opened slowly, allowing the quiet light of the hallway to spill into the room. Atlas stepped forward one careful pace, then paused as though remembering the discipline that had guided him through years of training. His eyes found Ethan instantly. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The room remained silent except for the steady rhythm of the monitor and the faint hum of the hospital ventilation system. Then Atlas' tail began to move slowly behind him, sweeping once across the floor with controlled excitement. Ethan's expression softened with unmistakable relief the moment he saw his partner standing there. His voice remained gentle but filled with recognition. "Hey, Atlas." The sound of his name spoken in that familiar tone erased the last distance between them. Atlas crossed the short space between the door and the bed with quiet purpose, his paws making almost no sound against the polished floor. When he reached the bedside, he stopped again, lifting his head slightly so that his eyes met Ethan directly. For several seconds, the shepherd simply looked at him, as though confirming with his own senses that the man before him had truly returned. Ethan lifted one hand slowly from the sheet and extended it toward the dog. Atlas stepped closer and lowered his head beneath the hand, allowing the familiar touch to settle gently against the thick fur between his ears. The movement was calm and deeply familiar, the silent language of two partners who had shared more days and nights together than most people ever would. Melissa watched from the side of the room with a quiet smile, while Dr. Halpern folded his arms and observed the moment with respectful patience. The reunion carried no noise or excitement, only the deep calm of recognition and trust that needed no explanation. Atlas rested his head lightly against the side of the bed, his tail still moving in slow, steady sweeps across the floor. Ethan's fingers moved through the fur along the dog's neck, the motion unhurried as though confirming that both of them had made it through the long night exactly as they always had. Outside the room, the hospital corridor continued its busy morning rhythm, nurses passing with charts and carts rolling quietly along the tile. Yet inside room 214, the atmosphere held a quiet peace that seemed to pause time itself. The Marine had awakened, and the partner who had kept watch through every hour of darkness was finally beside him once again. The room remained quiet after the reunion, the soft morning light settling across the bed while the steady beeping of the monitor continued like a calm heartbeat for the entire space. Atlas stayed close to Ethan's side, resting his head gently against the edge of the mattress while the Marine hand moved slowly through the thick fur along the shepherd's neck. The movement was simple and unhurried, The kind of familiar gesture that needed no words because both of them had repeated it countless times through long deployments and quiet moments between missions. Ethan's breathing had grown stronger now, and though his body still carried the weight of exhaustion, his eyes were fully awake, steady and aware as they watched his loyal partner beside him. Melissa Carter stepped closer to the bed again, careful not to interrupt the quiet bond unfolding in front of her. She checked the monitor readings once more before offering a reassuring smile. "Your recovery is moving in the right direction, Major Walker," she said gently. "The rest you had during the night helped more than you realize." Ethan nodded slowly, still running his fingers through the fur at the base of Atlas' ears. The shepherd leaned slightly into the touch, his tail sweeping slowly against the floor in a calm rhythm that showed how deeply settled he had become now that his watch had finally ended. Dr. Robert Halpern observed the scene with quiet respect before speaking in the calm tone that had guided countless patients through moments like this. "Your partner appears to have taken his assignment very seriously, Major. We have had staff passing through the hallway all morning telling the same story. He never left the door once during the entire night." Ethan's expression softened even further when he heard that. "That sounds like him," he replied quietly. "Atlas has always believed that staying close is part of the job." The shepherd lifted his head slightly when he heard his name again, his ears shifting forward as though the familiar sound carried meaning even in the calm atmosphere of the hospital room. Ethan's hand moved again across the dog head, the gentle motion full of appreciation for the silent loyalty that had followed him through every chapter of his service. Outside the door, the hallway continued its steady rhythm of activity. A pair of nurses walked past with charts in their hands while a hospital volunteer carried a fresh stack of blankets toward the patient wing. Yet even through the ordinary sounds of the building there remained a quiet awareness among the staff that something special had taken place in room 214. The story of the dog who had kept watch all night had already begun traveling through the morning conversations at the nurse's station. Inside the room, Ethan shifted slightly on the pillow, testing his strength, while Atlas remained close enough that the marine fingertips never lost contact with his fur. For the first time since waking, Ethan allowed himself a deeper breath, the kind that carries both relief and gratitude. Atlas lifted his head once more and met his eyes directly. The shepherd gaze carried the calm certainty of a partner who had never doubted the outcome of the long night. No words passed between them, yet the meaning was clear in the quiet room. The watch had been kept, the morning had arrived, and the bond that had carried them through years of shared duty remained exactly where it had always been. The room held a quiet warmth as late morning sunlight spread across the walls and floor, softening the clinical brightness of the hospital equipment and giving the space the calm feeling of a place where something difficult had finally passed. Major Ethan Walker rested against the raised pillow with a steadier breath now, his strength slowly returning as the hours moved forward. Atlas remained beside the bed, settled comfortably near Ethan's shoulder with the relaxed posture of a partner who finally understood that his watch had come to a peaceful end. The German shepherd ears flicked occasionally at the distant sounds of the hallway, yet his attention always returned to the man beside him as though the rest of the world no longer required his concern. Melissa Carter entered the room again carrying a small tablet with updated notes, while Dr. Robert Halpern followed behind her, reviewing the latest readings on the monitor with calm satisfaction. "Everything is continuing to improve," Dr. Halpern said gently while glancing toward Ethan. "Your body needed time to reset after a long strain, but your recovery is progressing exactly the way we hoped it would." Ethan listened quietly, nodding once as he absorbed the words. His hand rested against Atlas' neck, fingers occasionally brushing through the thick fur in a slow, thoughtful motion. The shepherd leaned slightly closer each time, accepting the familiar contact with quiet contentment. Melissa finished entering the updated information on the tablet before looking toward the pair beside the bed. "I believe someone here deserves a little recognition as well," she said with a soft smile while glancing down at Atlas. "Several of the nurses have been talking about him all morning. They say he kept the entire corridor under watch like it was his own post." Ethan looked toward the dog and allowed a small laugh to escape his tired voice. "That sounds exactly like something he would do," he replied. "Atlas has never believed in leaving a job unfinished." The shepherd lifted his head at the sound of his name, his amber eyes meeting Ethan's gaze once more with calm familiarity. Outside the door, the corridor remained active with the quiet movement of hospital staff. Yet the story of the loyal partner who had waited through the long night had already begun to spread among those who worked the early shift. A pair of nurses passed by the glass window and paused briefly to look inside, smiling when they saw the Marine awake and the German shepherd resting peacefully beside the bed. Inside the room, Ethan shifted slightly, sitting a little more upright with the support of the pillow. His strength was returning slowly but steadily, and the simple act of sitting more comfortably felt like a victory after the long hours of sleep. Atlas responded immediately to the change, adjusting his position so that he remained close enough for Ethan's hand to rest easily against his shoulder. Dr. Halpern watched the movement with quiet approval before closing the patient chart. "I believe the two of you have earned some quiet time," he said calmly. "The hardest part of the night has already passed." The words settled gently into the room as the doctor and nurse stepped toward the door, leaving Ethan and his partner in the peaceful silence that followed. Atlas rested his head lightly against the side of the bed once again, while Ethan's hand moved slowly along the shepherd neck, both of them sharing the calm understanding that sometimes the strongest kind of loyalty does not need to be spoken at all. The room grew quieter after the doctor and nurse stepped out, leaving the door gently closed behind them while the soft sounds of the hospital corridor faded into the background. "Major." Ethan Walker rested against the pillows, feeling the steady rhythm of his own breathing and the warmth of the sunlight stretching across the blanket. The long night had passed, and the calm of late morning carried a sense of renewal that settled gently over the entire room. Atlas remained beside the bed exactly where he had chosen to stay, his body relaxed now that the tension of the night was finally gone. The German shepherd lifted his head slightly whenever Ethan's hand moved, watching his partner with the quiet attentiveness that had always defined their bond. Ethan looked down at him for a moment, studying the familiar shape of the shepherd ears and the steady amber eyes that had followed him through so many miles and moments. "You kept watch, did you not, buddy?" he said softly. The words were calm, almost reflective, yet they carried deep gratitude beneath their simple tone. Atlas responded by lifting his head higher and giving a slow sweep of his tail across the floor, the movement gentle but certain. The gesture felt less like excitement and more like quiet confirmation. Outside the window, the sky over San Diego had turned bright and clear, the morning sun reflecting off distant buildings and the faint line of the Pacific far beyond the city streets. The light poured through the hospital blinds and stretched across the floor, creating warm lines of gold that slowly shifted with the passing hours. Ethan took another steady breath, allowing the peaceful silence to settle around him. His hand rested once more along Atlas' neck, fingers moving slowly through the thick fur while the shepherd leaned closer in comfortable trust. In that quiet moment, the hospital room no longer felt like a place of recovery alone. It felt like a place where something deeper had been quietly proven. Loyalty, Ethan thought, was not measured by loud gestures or grand speeches. Sometimes it was measured by something as simple as staying beside a door through a long night when the world had grown uncertain. Atlas had done exactly that. The shepherd rested his head lightly against the bed again, content now that the purpose of his watch had been fulfilled. Down the corridor, the day continued to move forward with the gentle rhythm of hospital life. Nurses spoke quietly at the station, carts rolled past patient rooms, and the story of the loyal war dog who had waited through the night had already begun to travel from one conversation to another. Yet inside room 214 the moment remained peaceful and personal, belonging only to the Marine and the partner who had never doubted that morning would come. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, not in sleep, but in quiet reflection. His hand remained resting against Atlas' shoulder, feeling the steady warmth of the loyal presence beside him. And in that calm sunlight-filled room, the truth of their bond remained simple and clear. Some soldiers guard a post for a single shift, but others remain on watch for as long as it takes, because loyalty remembers what time forgets.